Surrendering to God means releasing the illusion of control that we often hold on to so tightly. As humans, we crave certainty, predictability, and a sense that we are steering our own destiny. We plan, strategize, and work hard to create the life we want. But so often, despite our best efforts, things don't go according to plan. We hit roadblocks, face disappointments, and sometimes find ourselves completely lost, wondering why things aren't working out the way we expected. That frustration, that deep exhaustion from trying to figure everything out on our own, comes from holding on to something that was never meant to be in our hands. God never designed us to carry the weight of directing our own steps without Him. He is the one who knows the end from the beginning, the one who has already mapped out every detail of our journey. When we try to control everything, we are essentially telling God, "I've got this. I don't need you to direct me." And yet, time and time again, life proves that our control is limited. No matter how much we plan, we cannot control external circumstances, the actions of others, or even our own emotions at times. But God, in His infinite wisdom, is not only able to see what we cannot see, He is actively working things out for our good. Surrender is not a sign of weakness. It is an act of trust. It is saying, "God, I trust that your ways are higher than mine. I trust that you see what I cannot see. I trust that you love me enough to lead me in the right direction, even when I don't understand it." That level of trust requires humility. It requires acknowledging that our perspective is limited, that our understanding is finite, and that our ability to control outcomes is ultimately an illusion. When we surrender, we exchange anxiety for peace. We release the burden of trying to make everything happen in our own strength, and we step into the divine flow of God's plan. Many of us struggle with surrender because we equate it with passivity. We think that if we surrender to God, we are giving up on our dreams, settling for less, or losing our ability to make decisions. But surrender is not inactivity. It is intentional alignment with God's will. It is moving forward with faith rather than fear, trusting that as we walk in obedience, He will make our path straight. One of the greatest obstacles to surrender is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear that if we let go of control, God won't come through. But fear is a liar. Fear tries to convince us that we are safer holding on to control, when in reality, we are safest in the hands of the one who created us. Fear keeps us stuck, paralyzed, and hesitant to take the steps God is calling us to take. But when we surrender, we step into faith. Faith is believing that even when we can't see the whole picture, God is working behind the scenes. Faith is knowing that God is not just taking us somewhere, He is taking us somewhere good. Surrender also requires patience. In a world that thrives on instant gratification, waiting on God's timing can feel frustrating. We want answers now. We want doors to open immediately. We want to see the full plan laid out before we take a step. But God doesn't work on our timetable. He develops us in the waiting. He strengthens our character, deepens our trust, and prepares us for the blessings He has in store. When we resist surrender, we often delay the very breakthrough we are praying for. God's plan unfolds in His perfect timing, and when we surrender, we allow Him to do His work without interference. Another challenge to surrender is our own pride. We like to believe that we know what's best for us. We lean on our own understanding, our own logic, and our own wisdom. But Scripture reminds us that our wisdom is nothing compared to God's. Proverbs 3-5-6 tells us to trust in the Lord with all our heart and lean not on our own understanding. That means even when things don't make sense, even when the path God is leading us on seems unconventional or uncomfortable, we trust Him anyway. Surrender means letting go of our need to understand everything and embracing the peace that comes with knowing God is in control. When we resist surrender, we often find ourselves in cycles of frustration. We push, we strive, we try to force things to happen, and we end up drained and discouraged. But when we surrender, we experience a shift. Suddenly, we are no longer fighting against the current, we are flowing with it. We are no longer striving in our own strength, we are relying on His. And that is where true freedom is found. Surrender doesn't mean we stop dreaming, setting goals, or taking action. It means we release our grip and allow God to guide the process. Surrendering to God is a daily decision. It's not a one-time act, but a continuous posture of the heart. Every day we wake up and say, "Lord, I give you control. Lead me, guide me, and help me to follow your direction." Some days, faith is not just about believing in God. It is about moving in alignment with His will, even when the path is unclear. Too often, people wait for absolute clarity before they take action. They pray for signs, confirmations, and assurances that everything will go smoothly before they step forward. But real faith doesn't work that way. Faith requires movement. It demands stepping out even when we don't have all the answers, trusting that God will guide us as we go. When God called Abraham to leave his homeland and go to a place that he would show him, there was no map, no itinerary, no detailed plan of what lay ahead. Abraham had to move before he knew where he was going. That is the essence of faith. It is walking forward even when the destination is unknown. Many people struggle with this because they want God to reveal the entire journey before they take the first step. They want certainty, but certainty eliminates the need for faith. Faith is trusting God enough to walk in obedience even when we don't have all the details. Movement in faith does not mean reckless action. It means stepping forward in response to God's voice, even when it feels uncomfortable. Comfort and faith do not go hand in hand. If we are always seeking comfort, we will rarely step into the fullness of what God has for us. Faith stretches us, pushes us beyond our limits, and requires us to rely on God rather than our own understanding. The problem is that many people want the rewards of faith without the risk of movement. They want the blessings, the breakthroughs, and the open doors, but they don't want to take the uncomfortable steps required to receive them. God rarely provides all the answers up front because he wants to develop our trust in him. If we knew everything ahead of time, we would rely on our knowledge rather than on his guidance. Faith is about obedience without all the details. It is about taking the step when God says, go, even when we feel unqualified, unprepared, or unsure. Many people delay their destiny because they are waiting for a perfect moment that will never come. They keep asking for another sign, another confirmation, another reassurance, when in reality, God has already spoken. Delayed obedience is disobedience. When God tells us to move, hesitation can cause us to miss the very opportunities he is placing before us. Movement in faith does not mean that the journey will always be easy. In fact, it is often filled with challenges. But obstacles do not mean that we are on the wrong path. Sometimes the greatest opposition comes right before the breakthrough. This is where many people give up. They take a step, face difficulty, and assume that they must have heard God wrong. But faith is not just about starting it, it is about continuing, even when the road is rough. The Israelites had to march around the walls of Jericho for 7 days before they saw them fall. What if they had stopped on day 6 because nothing had happened yet? Many people quit right before their breakthrough because they don't see immediate results. Faith requires persistence, even when progress is not visible. Faith also requires trust in God's timing. Sometimes we move forward and expect immediate fulfillment of the promise, but God operates on a different timeline. David was anointed as king long before he actually took the throne. Joseph had a dream of leadership, but went through years of hardship before stepping into his destiny. The process is just as important as the promise. God uses seasons of waiting and preparation to refine us, strengthen us, and build the character necessary to sustain the blessing when it comes. If we rush ahead of God's timing, we may find ourselves in places we are not yet ready to handle. Faith is not just about moving, it is about moving in step with God. One of the greatest struggles with movement in faith is dealing with fear. Fear whispers that we will fail, that we will look foolish, that we are not qualified. Fear magnifies the unknown and tries to convince us that staying still is safer than stepping forward. But fear and faith cannot coexist. Fear keeps us stagnant, while faith propels us into purpose. The enemy wants to keep people stuck in fear because he knows that when they step out in faith, they become dangerous to his plans. Every person God used in the Bible had to overcome fear in order to move. Moses doubted his ability to speak. Gideon questioned whether he was strong enough. Peter had to step out of the boat in the middle of the storm. But each of them saw God's power in action when they took the step. Faith also requires focus. When Peter walked on water, he was fine as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus. The moment he looked at the wind and waves, he started sinking. Many people start strong in faith but lose focus when distractions and difficulties arise. They allow the opinions of others, the size of the obstacles, or their own doubts to shake them. Obedience is the key that unlocks divine direction. Many people pray for guidance, asking God to show them the next step, but they hesitate when it comes time to act on what he has already spoken. They want clarity before commitment, assurance before action, and a full picture before taking the first step. But God does not operate that way. He gives instructions one step at a time, and only when we obey what he has already said do we gain access to what he will say next. When God gives a command, it is not a suggestion. It is a divine invitation to walk in alignment with his will. but obedience requires trust. It requires believing that his instructions are for our good, even when they challenge our comfort or contradict our logic. Many times, people struggle with obedience because they want to understand the full plan before they commit to following it. But faith does not work like that. God often gives partial instructions, revealing just enough for us to take the next step. He does this because obedience is not about understand, it is about trust. If we truly trust him, we will obey even when we don't fully understand. Partial obedience is still disobedience. Many people pick and choose which of God's commands they want to follow. They obey when it is convenient, when it aligns with their personal desires, or when it makes sense to them. But true obedience is full surrender. It is following God's direction completely, even when it requires sacrifice. Saul lost his kingdom because he obeyed God halfway. He followed some instructions but modified others to fit his own reasoning. That is what many people do today. They follow God's will as long as it does not disrupt their plans, their comfort, or their timeline. But selective obedience will never lead to the full manifestation of God's promises. God's direction often requires movement before understanding. When the Israelites were trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army, God told Moses to stretch out his staff. There was no indication that anything would happen, but obedience unlocked the miracle. The water did not part until Moses obeyed. Naaman, a commander in the Syrian army, was told to dip in the Jordan River 7 times to be healed of leprosy. At first, he resisted because it did not make sense to him. But when he finally obeyed, his healing came. Many times, people delay their breakthrough because they hesitate to obey what seems illogical, inconvenient, or uncomfortable. But God's ways are higher than our ways, and his instructions are designed to position us for what he has already prepared. Obedience is a test of faith. When God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, it made no sense. Isaac was the son of promise, the one through whom God had said nations would come. But Abraham obeyed without hesitation. He trusted that God had a plan, even if he could not see it. Because of his obedience, God provided a ram in the thicket, a substitute sacrifice, and confirmed his covenant with Abraham. Many times, God asks for obedience in areas that seem contradictory to his promises. He may ask someone to leave a secure job, to walk away from a relationship, or to give sacrificially. The test is not about loss, it is about trust. When we obey, we make room for God to reveal his provision, his faithfulness, and his perfect plan. Delayed obedience can lead to unnecessary struggles. Jonah was told to go to Nineveh, but he ran in the opposite direction. Instead of following God's command immediately, he found himself in the belly of a great fish, suffering the consequences of his disobedience. Many people find themselves in difficult situations not because God has abandoned them, but because they have not followed what he already instructed them to do. When we ignore his direction, we end up taking detours that could have been avoided. But even in those detours, God is merciful. He redirected Jonah and gave him another opportunity to obey. God's grace allows for restoration, but obedience is always the best path to take from the start. Obedience does not always feel good in the moment. It requires discipline, sacrifice, and trust. Sometimes it means letting go of things that seem beneficial but are not in alignment with God's best. It may require saying no to opportunities that look promising but are not part of his plan. It may involve standing firm in faith when the world offers easier alternatives. But every act of obedience brings us closer to God's perfect will. Obedience also leads to supernatural favor. When Peter had been fishing all night without catching anything, Jesus told him to cast his net on the other side. Peter could have dismissed the instruction as unnecessary, but instead, he obeyed. The result was an overflow of fish, more than he could handle. Obedience positions us for blessings we could never achieve on our own. It shifts our lives from striving to receiving, from struggling to walking in divine provision. Many people hesitate to move forward in life because they believe they need to have everything perfectly aligned before they take action. They think they need to be fully qualified, fully prepared, and fully capable before they step into their calling. But God does not require perfection. He requires willingness. He is not looking for people who have it all together. He is looking for those who are available, obedient, and ready to be used. Too often, people disqualify themselves from their own destiny because they focus on their flaws, weaknesses, and past mistakes. They assume that because they are not perfect, they cannot be effective. But throughout history, God has used imperfect people to accomplish extraordinary things. Moses doubted his ability to speak, yet God used him to lead an entire nation to freedom. David was just a shepherd boy when he was anointed to be king. Peter was impulsive and even denied Jesus, yet he became the foundation of the early church. Paul persecuted Christians before he became one of the greatest apostles. Time and time again, God has proven that he does not choose people based on their perfection, but based on their willingness to follow him. The enemy tries to convince people that their imperfections disqualify them, but in reality, it is often those very imperfections that God uses to demonstrate his power. When people recognize their own limitations, they are more likely to rely on God instead of their own strength. Society often places an unrealistic standard of perfection on people. The world tells them that they must have the right education, the right connections, the right appearance, and the right background to be successful. But God's kingdom operates differently. He chooses the unexpected, the overlooked, and the unqualified to fulfill his plans. This is because his strength is made perfect in weakness. When people step into their calling despite their flaws, it becomes clear that their success is not because of them, but because of God working through them. Many people delay pursuing their purpose because they are waiting for the perfect moment. They think they need more experience, more resources, or more validation from others before they begin. But there will never be a perfect moment. If people wait for every condition to be ideal, they will never take the first step. God does not call people when they are ready, he calls them when it is time. And when he calls, he equips. He does not expect people to have everything figured out before they obey. He provides what is needed along the way. The key is to step out in faith, even when things feel uncertain. Perfectionism can be a form of fear. Some people do not move forward because they are afraid of failure. They think that if they cannot do something perfectly, they should not do it at all. But failure is a part of growth. Every great leader, innovator, and world changer has experienced failure. What sets them apart is not that they never failed, but that they did not let failure stop them. God is not concerned with people making mistakes. He is concerned with their willingness to keep going despite mistakes. A righteous person falls 7 times and gets back up again. The true measure of success is persistence, not perfection. God often allows people to go through struggles and hardships because those experiences shape them for their purpose. Many people who are called to help others have gone through deep pain themselves. They have walked through seasons of brokenness, disappointment, and loss. But those experiences have equipped them with empathy, wisdom, and resilience. God does not waste pain. What the enemy meant for harm, God can use for good. The very things that people believe disqualify them are often the things that make them most effective in their calling. Their testimony becomes the key that unlocks someone else's breakthrough. Comparison can also be a major obstacle to stepping into purpose. Many people look at others and feel inadequate. They see someone else's success and assume they could never measure up. But God's plan for one person is not the same as his plan for another. Each person has a unique assignment, and comparing oneself to others only leads to insecurity and discouragement. The only thing that matters is being faithful to what God has called each individual to do. There is no competition in the kingdom of God-only obedience. Another challenge is the pressure to meet human expectations. People often feel weighed down by the opinions of others. They worry about what people will say if they step out in faith. They fear criticism, rejection, or being misunderstood. But obedience to God is more important than approval from people. If Jesus himself was criticized, mocked, and rejected, then his followers should expect the same. Living for the approval of people will always lead to compromise, but living for God's purpose brings true fulfillment.